But welcome everybody. This is the first of our SYNAPSE Seminar series for the year. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose unceded lands we're meeting. And it's really exciting today that we have something a little bit different from our usual kind of talk. So Lucy Aplin, who works here at the ANU but also at the University of Zurich, and he's going to talk to us about culture and cultural evolution in birds. So thanks so much, Lucy.
All right, I'll just get into it. Okay, so, right, it's a little bit different to your usual topics, so I thought I would start with the basic sort of what is culture in birds. And I think the easiest place to start if we're asking about that is actually to ask, to start not with a bird, but with this much more familiar species, the chimpanzee. So as I'm sure many of you know, in the 80s and 90s, researchers studying populations in Africa were able to find these behaviors which differed between sites across Africa and didn't appear to have any sort of ecological or genetic underpinning. And it started with this sort of percussive stone tool use, but it wasn't restricted to that. There were examples that range from termite fishing to hand clasping to the way they drink water. And Andy White and colleagues put this together in a sort of map of sites across Africa and found that there are a whole range of these variants that were either present in some sites and not, or where sites differed in the techniques they used. And they argued that these could only be considered a form of cultural traits. And at the same time this was happening in the 1970s and actually before, right into the early 20th century, people were doing much the same thing in birdsong. So this is a really classic model species, the white-crowned sparrow that's on the west coast of the US. And you can see here that the population that ranges down from Oregon to California shows different song types in different populations. These are spectrograms of the different song types. And they argued that these can only really be considered vocal dialects, and they're actually incredibly stable. Some of these populations have now been studied for 70 years, and the dialects have remained stable over this time. So this has then been matched in birdsong with a long history of lab research in species like zebra finches, which have really, I think, in unparalleled detail across any animal, probably including humans, shown the sort of neural genetic underpinnings of these traits. And we know they're copied from some from fathers, passed down this way and learned over a sensitive period in the first year of life and then stable over the rest of their lives. So that was the first two, but since then we've added information from a wide variety of largely birds and mammals, but also there might be some case in fish as well, and in a wide range of behavioural domains, from song and vocal calls through tool use through to migration. So we know, for example, that geese culturally inherit their migration routes from following family members, and more widely in foraging behaviour. And of course, we can't ask animals about their experience or their emotions or how they feel culturally. So to study these behaviors in animals, we have to develop really functional definitions that allow us to test on a sort of even playing field. So the way we sort of define a cultural trait in animals is a behavior that's acquired by observing or interacting with others or interacting with their products, for example, their discarded tools, that are shared in groups or populations, and that persist over time. And we could probably add this sort of vague bit on the end here, that it's important that it be transmitted across age classes so that there's the potential to be transmitted over generations, that individuals have memory to retain these, and that it's trait-based copying so that we have cultural units that we can sort of define beyond one individual. So as I said, it's becoming increasingly clear we have lots of evidence for cultural traits, largely across birds and mammals. And some of these cultures, like in chimpanzees, we now also have evidence through archaeology that they persisted over thousands of years. But on the other side of the coin, We also know that culture can potentially be an important source of behavioral flexibility because it can change at a much faster rate than genetic adaptation can, potentially within a single generation. And so this emergence of culture and how culture changes over time is what I'm going to really focus on and what most of my work is focused on. So there's two potential routes that culture can emerge and change over time. The first is through the spread of new innovations through populations. So this can be potentially extremely rapid within a single generation. And much of the theory we use to study this process of spread of innovation is actually derived from economics, like this classic book some of you might know, The Diffusion of Innovation by Rogers. However, when innovations are spread or new behaviours are already established in populations, they're not necessarily static, but can also change over time in a sort of Darwinian-like manner. So we can, for example, see drift if neutral errors, copy errors are introduced, potentially selection, cultural selection, particular variants that are favoured, refinement by selection on a trait by many minds working on it, or even cultural exchange leading to sort of recombination of traits. And this is one that's obviously very important when we're thinking about human populations. So I'm going to give you evidence for both of these processes that are occurring in birds. And I'm going to, but before I do that, if I can make my slide move on. Oh, we've got the spinning wheel of doom. Handle it. Oh, there we go. Wasn't that hard a slide to load, but okay. Before we do this, I want you to keep in mind that what we call a kind of cultural trait is this sort of amorphous, ephemeral, sort of emergent property, and we can't measure it directly, although sometimes we can if we're lucky, like through tools or a song. And it really emerges through an interaction between these three factors. So the social system, sort of your access to information, the environment, especially the resource landscape that you have access to, and the cognition of the individual that's learning the trait. So disentangling these is kind of vital to understanding the emergence of culture and the sort of cultural outcomes we expect. So keep this in mind as we go on. And to talk about it, I'm going to draw from two study systems, one we've already mentioned, but this one is the great tit. They're a common garden bird that ranges all the way across Eurasia, and they're opportunistic, innovative, and generalist, and very good urban adapters. They're doing very well in our human world. And the sulphur-crested cockatoo, which is another anthropogenic success story, they're also doing very well in our human-modified world. The difference between the two is that these are basically a feathered primate. They have a lifespan almost on par with humans and a very large brain size for any species, mammal or bird. And this is important because it means that there's been less potential for genetic change in this species to rapid anthropogenic change. So we can sort of disentangle genetic and cultural change a little bit easier. While this species, because it's has very rapid generation times, it's very tolerant to disturbance, it's become an experimental model, especially for a lot of work in Europe. So they're a great experimental system. They're a little bit like lab mice of the wild for birds. Okay, but great tits are also great. They give us the first example of an animal innovation when in 1921, birds in the south of England started to open milk bottles on doorsteps. And this then appeared to spread across Britain in a real exponential way, persisted for something like 30 years until we changed to plastic bottles and they can't get through plastic. So we can't say exactly what happened here, but we can hypothesize that it might have been something like this. So we had a new opportunity, a cream on top of milk, an innovation in behavior, and some number of individuals, we don't know how many, spread through the population of this innovation, leading to a persistent population level change that, given their average generation time is 2 years, is certainly persisting over many generations, and we could perhaps call a new cultural inherited trait. So to try and understand this pathway, I worked on this question in Wytham Woods, a very cold place to work in winter, with Ben Sheldon at Oxford when I was a PhD and postdoc. And then I continued this work in this woodland in the south of Germany when I was a Mexican group leader, pretty much until I moved to ANU, although I've got one leftover postdoc who's still working there on the tits. So in both populations, we tagged birds with these passive transponder tags, which involved catching them. These are basically the same thing in your fob, and they ping when they come near to an antenna. And so this can allow us to sort of get an idea of movements on quite a large scale because they're very small and very cheap. And so myself and a team of researchers looking at the social networks of these birds mapped the social networks of White and Woods. It's about 1,500 birds. Every point is a bird, and the line between them is the proportion of times two birds have spent foraging together over the whole time we've seen them. And the different colours here are the different social communities we were able to find in this population. So we were able to demonstrate that these networks have all sorts of functional significance for the birds that live in them. But I'm not going to go into that now. What I want you to take away is just how connected this population is. This is about 350 hectares, so it's quite a large area. So for the first cultural diffusion experiment I did, that I want to talk about, I brought birds into the lab and I trained them to use this sliding door puzzle. So they have to just move the door and they can get a mealworm. And then I put it back out into the wild. And as you can see, many birds then interacted with the puzzle. And what's really important to note here is that every puzzle box is equally solvable using an equally rewarding, equally difficult alternative. So just pushing the door from the other way. So if the population is biased towards the way I introduced, then I can infer from that that they're copying from each other. All right, so what did we find? Well, first we look at the spread dynamics. So these are our experimental populations and these are our control where there was no trained demonstrator. And you can see they follow these really classic S-shaped diffusion curves, sort of a slow takeoff initially, then an exponential increase for a plateau. Very nice, classic economic spread. And we could also observe that it's spread through social networks. So here, this is the individual I trained and they're turning red when they learn the behavior. You can see very clearly how important social network ties are to the acquisition of this behavior. And this also allows us to ask whether individuals are more or less likely to learn based off what we'd expect given their social opportunity to. And when we look at that, we see that younger birds are much faster to pick it up than older birds. Okay, so finally, we saw that in our experimental populations, they were heavily biased to the behavior that we had initially introduced, whether that was left or right, and not much went on in the control populations. We went back over 3 generations, so this is 3 different winters. And this is just one population, this is T3, and you can see that the behavior, the arbitrary tradition of pushing to the left persists just as strongly in the 3rd generation as the 1st. And the reason why this happens is because when we look at the learning mechanisms, so the probability of them adopting an option based off what they've just seen, we see they're not doing that randomly. They're actually positive frequency dependent learners, what we would call conformist learners. So they're disproportionately adopting the behavior that the majority of their group are expressing. And that makes this behavior really entrenched in the population. Okay, so how about the mechanism for overgenerational transmission? So we, in a later experiment, actually put these puzzle boxes out while the chicks were still in the nest. So the parents were foraging from them, and we asked what happened when the chicks first fledged and came out with their parents. They only stay with their parents for about 2 weeks. This is a very fast living little bird here. It's not exactly, chimpanzee. And what we saw is actually that if they had 1 or 2 solving parents, they were much faster to then start, once they were feeding independently, start to use the puzzle box. But if they had no parents, they still started to pick it up. And we also saw that they weren't following the side choice of their parents, but instead adopting the side choice of their peer group, the other juveniles they're foraging with. So what it seems like in this species is that vertical transmission from parent to offspring can sort of facilitate behavioral acquisition, but actually most of it's happening horizontally within the same generation. And this probably then sort of explains this really rapid spread of information that we can get.
Can I just ask a question about that?
Yeah.
How much time do they spend with their parents as opposed to peers or siblings? Is the frequency of time related to the learning of this?
Yes, but this is only looking at their initial learning, so it's sort of really all just in that first month of life.
Right.
So they spend about 2 weeks with their parents after fledgling, and then they spend about, they sort of gradually move into hanging out with their parents, friends, chicks, their extended social network, and then they start to join adult flocks after that. So this is only looking at their first initial acquisition, so it's only in that short period. Later on, when they move into the population, I assume they would gradually move towards what the population towards because they're receiving that information all the time, and they're always taking on this information.
Thanks.
So in this species, at least, we can show that new innovation on the part of very few individuals is a sort of realistic mechanism for population level change through the rapid spread of innovation. And then once it reaches population level persistence, it can re-emerge every year and persist over time. But it's not straightforward. We see that social networks determine how this happens, demographics, so age structure should be important, and also learning biases and transmission modes all kind of contribute to the form that final culture takes. Okay, so the environment's changed once, allowing this to happen. That means it's probably going to change again. So what do we think might happen in this case, in the case of ongoing environmental change? Would we expect them just to go extinct? Or do we expect that we might end up with some form of subcultural or maladaptive cultural traits? And I know that these are observed in humans. It's incredibly controversial whether we can see this in any other animal. Okay, so to test this, I went into 4 populations with established traditions for left or right, like we have here. And then I first gave them equal low rewards for doing either behavior, and this is to see how much exploration we would expect if they're receiving a reward they didn't previously get. So what's the disappointment kind of move? And then I gave them unequal rewards. So the behavior which was very rare now gives you a higher reward, and the behavior which was very common now gives you a lower reward. Still food, but it's not good food. Okay, so what do we see? So this is a bird. It's just arrived, another bird had solved the bad side, and it's not having any of that. Switches straight to the good side. So here's our starting position. So left or right populations, we see absolutely no change with low food rewards. But with unequal payoffs, about half the population has switched after a 3-week period. Although, as you can see, it's not a complete change. So what's the mechanism here? So we did some reinforcement modeling to look at this. And what it looks like is going on is actually they remain conformist. So there's no change in the way they're learning. No matter, like they don't seem to be able to distinguish between the sides, or at least change the way they learn observing others solving. But their personal payoff experience, or the personal experience is payoff biased. So if they get a chance to experience the higher reward, they prefer that in future. That makes sense. There's a difference between the input and the memory of birds. And they get that chance to experience the higher reward because it's an incredibly open turnover fission fusion population. So here's 2 individuals that preferred the other side to start with, and the information emerges slowly from them, but through this continual remixing of groups, occasionally they experience a group where the majority does the rare behavior. They then prefer that in future, and you get a snowball effect across the population.
You might come to this, but what if you make it probabilistic? Because a lot of things in nature are not going to be one-to-one relationships. So what if you've got a slight bias between the payoff, but it's not always, you know, if you go right, you get 70% chance of that, or 30% chance of that, but it's switched around the other way.
Our hardware wasn't quite good enough because it's not dispenser exactly. So no, I haven't looked at that, but it would be very interesting to do that. I've done a couple of other things which I will get to, but not that particular one. But the last thing on this point is that it's still age dependent in this species. So if you're only 1 year old, you have a much higher updating rate. So if you acquire new behavior, you prefer that behavior over previous experience. While that's not the case at all if you're an older bird. And the result of that is if you're 1 or 2, you're very likely to have switched. But if you're older than that, you're very unlikely to have switched your behavior towards the end of the experiment, which tells us that the demographics of the population are going to matter for the flexibility of that population. Okay, so that was over time. What about over space? So we know these birds live in very variable environments, habitats ranging from the center of cities to pine forest to deciduous forest to very up high in Finland through very cold forests and all the way down to the Mediterranean. So they can disperse between these areas and potentially face very changed environments over space as well as time. So we did this experiment in the lab. This was Michael's work, who's a PhD now postdoc in the lab. We tracked them using barcode systems to get very fine detailed tracking. And we brought them into these aviaries for sort of temporary periods of time in the winter and then released them again. So in this experiment, I don't have a picture of that aviary, so you're just going to have to imagine it. We had 2 types of aviaries. One's decorated with deciduous forest shrubbery, and one's decorated like a pine forest. So there are 2 different types of habitats. And then we had actually 3 types of reward in this experiment. We had seed, that's the lowest, with mealworms, which are the yummiest, and they're a whole meal. And these things called buffalo worms, which are about the tiny little worms that they like better than seed, but not so much as mealworms. So this is the experimental design. We had a pre-immigration setup where birds were in one of these 2 environments and where they learned through the introduction of a tutor and diffusion into the population to solve the task pushing a door one way, which would result in buffalo worms with a sort of balanced design. Some of these birds remained in these populations as residents, and they just continued to solve in the same environment, but they now got a kind of boost up in their reward. So they used to get buffalo worms, they now got mealworms, happy, just doing what they're doing. And then we had immigrants who were moved between these populations, and they experienced something different. So when they moved, they used to get buffalo worms, and now they're still getting buffalo worms, but the locals are getting mealworms for what they're doing. Okay, and this was in a sort of 2-way design, so they could move between the same environment and get the same reward. They could or see the same reward. They could move between different environments, get the same reward, or they could move in a sort of asymmetric environment reward sort of setup, right? So the resource is different, all the resources the same, the environment's different, all the environment's the same. Bit of a complicated one to explain, and it was very complicated to do. Okay, so here's our result. So this just shows the immigrants, and just look at the black line because that's the sort of average. And up here is what the residents are doing, which is different to what they were originally doing. And down here is sticking to what they originally did. And what you can see is that in asymmetric environments with asymmetric payoffs, they switch very rapidly to what the residents are doing. And they switch also in symmetric environments with asymmetric payoffs a little bit less rapidly. They have a sort of middling effect in asymmetric environments with symmetric payoffs, and they don't do much in symmetric environments with symmetric resources. And when we look at the mechanism for this, we see that actually they change the way they learn. So this movement into a new environment switches, when there's new resource and new environment, switches payoff biased learning in the birds that we don't see when they move into the same environment. So there's something about changing environments that changes the way they learn. And in addition to that, they also just pay more attention to other individuals when they move into a new environment. So what we see is like a whole range of different learning biases in these birds, depending on both their age and also the sort of context they're subject to. Okay, so that's the sort of spread of innovation and changing environments. I now want to switch to evidence for cultural evolution in these birds. And the evidence that cultures can kind of change adaptively over time. I'm not going to talk about drift, but I'm going to sort of touch on these ones. So whether through cultural selection and refinement, recombination, behaviours can become more efficient or more complex. I'm very carefully not using the word cumulative cultural evolution here, because that's not my ball game. I'm just interested in what they do. Okay, so this is one bird solving this puzzle box and the time it takes to physically push that door open and get the food. So this is in seconds. And you can see that over 600 times solving that puzzle box, it gets much, much faster, more efficient doing this. But this is only one single individual. This is what we'd expect. But if we look at generations, we see the same effect. So knowledgeable birds retain their skill level from year to year. They keep the same speed. But new birds in later generations are faster initially to solve. So this is the first speed of the first solve on average in generation 1, generation 2, generation 3. And this is just of naive birds that kind of first come in that generation. So we seem to have a sort of evidence for a cultural legacy effect that these birds' first solve is affected by their learning experience, which is shaped by the sort of refinement that's going on within individual learning in those earlier generations. So that's in terms of speed. We wanted to look at how social dynamics affect this in more kind of explicit ways. So we brought it back into the lab, and this is with Michael. And here they're just in one environment, but it's the same sort of deal, wild birds kept in these aviaries and then released again. So in this case, we created an efficient and a less efficient solution. So we did this by just making the door off-center. So if you push one way, it's faster than pushing the other way. And we trained all the tutors, one per population, on the inefficient way to solve this puzzle. And then we had two conditions. So we released them into groups, let it diffuse in the groups, and then we had two types of groups. Groups that were static, they just got to sit out the 6 weeks in the aviary and then get released again. And groups which experienced turnover. So every week we randomly took out 2 and put 2 new birds in. So what did we see? And we could consider this fission-fusion dynamics or generational turnover. We don't really want to label it as one or the other. So it's pretty dramatic. In static groups, we saw that they're completely stuck on the inefficient side. They don't change over the experimental time, while in turnover groups, every population has changed completely to the efficient side by the end of the experiment, except for one where the behavior went completely extinct, which is important to come back to. So he then modeled this, and seems really important that this turnover be moderate. So under moderate levels of turnover like this, you see much faster rates of cultural evolution. But if the turnover is too high, the behavior can go extinct through stochasticity, and it can never potentially not get reinvented, which is what happened in the birds. So in addition to this, we can again look at how fast they solve the door, like I was mentioning before in the wild populations. We see initially that the static populations in black are faster because every individual bird has more experience. But by the end of the experiment, the turnover populations are faster at solving the door, despite each individual having less experience. So it does seem like turnover can really accelerate the cultural evolution of efficiency. So we would expect that, I think at least, that selection for efficient behavior would be quite common in many species, because you kind of get these sort of cognitive bottlenecks that are going to, we're going to have an innate preference for variants which are easier to learn, and they will often be more efficient. But I think selection for complexity is going to be much, much rarer. But we did want to look at whether or not we could also sort of generate that here in this population. So we did this by asking if it was possible for them to show sort of recombinatory cultures, 2-step behaviors. So we had our populations, it was 3 generations later, but that's fine, they have really good memories, which are knowledgeable on one of these 2 sliding door tasks. Then we introduced what we called the old-fashioned telephone task. So they have to turn this dial to make it match up with the hole. And we diffused that as well. And it shows very similar diffusion dynamics as the sliding door task. And then we introduced this tricky puzzle, which they have to do one thing and then the other thing. And there's actually 8 possible ways you can solve this. You can slide, then spin, or spin and slide, and you can do it in either direction in all different combinations. So we did this in a 3-step way. So first we introduced this. Populations are already knowledgeable in the sliding door. Then we kind of scaffolded it by giving them a low reward for doing one of the 2 steps and high reward for doing both steps. And then we put it out in the next generation. We had knowledgeable birds from the first generation, and here they only got rewarded for doing this full 2-step task. So what did we see? Well, as I said, we had good diffusion of information of this single-step task. For the scaffolded complex task, we found that if birds were knowledgeable of both components separately, they were very fast to put them together and do both together. If they were knowledgeable of one, they appeared to asocially explore, work out the second one, and put them both together. So they could also learn that. Okay, but they were getting partial rewards for doing one. But in the second generation, of the fully naive birds, only 10% learnt this complex task. So it really dropped right down. This is from 80% learning a single step to 10%. And they did so in this sort of funny way. They socially learned single components and then put them together themselves. But this depended on the production of single components, which didn't happen very often because the knowledgeable birds were just doing the whole thing as a package. But occasionally they would sort of do one at a time. Maybe they got interrupted, they got bored, whatever. And then they could learn a single one and put it together themselves. And I think what this tells us is that these birds showed no evidence of active teaching. And I think it shows us how important like scaffolding learning is, and which is what humans do when they teach, like giving partial information and allowing you to build on it. And when they're not given that scaffolding here rewarded for each step, then it's much, much harder for them to pick up complex behaviors. And as a sort of side note, what's also interesting is that we see that if we look at variation between populations, so this is one population, this is another population, there's 3 sites in each population, we see that traditions or cultural traits completely break down. So basically everyone's doing it every which way. And that's because, of course, they're asocially putting them together themselves. And we do see some site differences, but these are probably because there's a subset of the single options going on in each site. So you're going to get subset of the total 8 behaviors at each site, but there's no singular cultures going on. So I think this kind of tells us that, at least in this species, cultural selection for increasing complexity is unlikely to happen. I think at 10%, it's not going to last over populations because of this level of turnover. And it's cognitively constrained and probably socially constrained because they're not scaffolding. We're now doing a bit of work. This is just a teaser, looking at how they pay attention when they learn. So these are sort of 3D posture reconstruction that Michael's doing, but that's just at the beginning stages to try and get more of these mechanisms. Okay. So to sort of summarize this main part of the talk, I just want to return to this sort of schema of our 3 cogs in our cultural machine of cognition, ecology, and social systems. And I think what this work shows you is that when you start to really pick at each bit of this in these sort of good experimental system, that they're all really important. So social networks and age structure will determine how things spread and how rapidly. Turnover is really important, both for the likelihood of things persisting and also the rate of cultural evolution. And immigration is also important, the sort of movement of knowledgeable birds in the system. We also see that how things vary over time and space matters. Although this part is the part I think I've explored the least, like in your question, the resource landscape could be explored much more and probably matters a lot. And then we also see that there's sort of an interaction here. So the transmission modes, whether it's horizontal or vertical, matters a lot, as does the cognitive abilities of individuals to learn complex tasks. And the cognitive biases, whether individuals are sort of socially learning randomly or they're conformist or payoff bias, both matters for the eventual culture and also changes depending on these other factors like their age or whether they're moving in space. Okay, So of course, this is all very experimental and very proof of concept. Does this really affect any way in which animals actually adaptively respond to environmental change in the real world? So to ask this, we need ideally, like I mentioned before, a species with a much longer generation time and a shorter exposure to human impact. So they've had much less potential for genetic change, which can allow us to sort of disentangle these. And this is where the sulphur-crested cockatoo comes in, especially populations in urban centres in Australia, where the sort of extreme anthropogenic impact that occurs through urbanisation is much more recent than like in Europe, where I was studying the tits. I'm sure you're very all familiar with the sulphur-crested cockatoo, the most excellent of cockatoos. But let me quickly introduce you. So as I said before, they're opportunistic, they're innovative, they're generalist in their diet, they're neophilic in their behaviour, so they like novelty. And like the tits, they inhabit a really wide range of habitats, all the way from Tasmania to Papua New Guinea and urban environments, agricultural environments. They'll do the lot. And this includes urban centres in Sydney and Canberra. And before I get onto that, I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we work to study these birds. So this is the Gadigal people of northern Sydney, the Darawal speaking people of Sutherland Shire and Stanley Park areas, and the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people of Canberra. And we talked to some elders in the Darawal speaking people, and they told us that the sulphur-crested cockatoo is an important bird for them as well. Okay, so cockatoos are like tits in many ways, but they also differ from tits in two really important cogs in this cultural machine. One of these is that for the primatologists, their relative brain size is similar to a capuchin monkey. So they deserve their name of feathered primates. And I don't have time to go into this, but Lisa's here, so I'm very glad to show the brain of the sulphur-crested cockatoo. That's the work she does. It's her brain. And everyone tends to say that they have a brain like a walnut, but they really do have a brain like a walnut. But there's no wasted space here. It's packed full of neurons at a much higher density than the vast majority of birds and much, much higher than mammals. So in terms of total absolute neuron number, they're more like a macaque. We also know that they're very socially complex, which is other work we're doing. Okay, so they're cognitively complex. And then the other way in which they differ is that while both tits and cockatoos are very highly social, they have very different social systems. So cockatoos have communal roosts. So 100 or more individuals sleep in the same trees every night for decades, probably longer. And then they exploit the area around this site in sort of fission-fusion foraging parties. So here you can see the GPS track of 4 birds at the Royal Botanic Gardens roost in Sydney. And they're using the sort of, this is about 3 kilometres radius around this area. And these areas then overlap with other roost groups. There's actually another roost group here and another one, I think it's here, which means that you do get them interacting with other roost groups when they're out, and some birds also float between roosts. So this leads to a sort of clustered multi-level network, like you can see this example of 3 roosts from northern Sydney, quite different from the very open system of the tits. Okay, so the great thing about working with urban birds is that you can use the many eyes of citizen science. So through our citizen science platform, we collect many things, but also cases of behavioural innovations. And this one was reported to me in 2016. And this is the only one I'm going to tell you about today. This is what we call the bin opening innovation. So when we this first reported to me, I thought, oh my God, we have to study that. And so we started running an annual online survey from 2018. And it was first reported to me down in Sutherland, just south of Sutherland Shire, so kind of between Sydney and Wollongong. And just to show you, this is the diffusion map of 4 years of annual citizen science surveys. Each of these so the dots are in the centre of different suburbs, and the connections between neighbouring suburbs. And the red is where it was first reported to us back in the day. and it's spreading over time. So we use sort of spatial network diffusion analysis on this, and as you won't be surprised to hear, there's very strong evidence that this spread is most likely due to social learning and transmission rather than through asocial learning. Although we do have potentially another innovation that occurred up here in 2019, although we can't rule out could be a very long distance dispersal by a bird. It might be, so it's gone from 3 suburbs to 61 suburbs in our latest annual survey. It might be slowing down, but I'll tell you why that's happening in a second. So to study the behaviour intensively, we went to one kind of manageable hotspot where we knew what happened, which is Stanwell Park, lovely coastal town halfway between Sydney and Wollongong that's nicely ringed with mountains and forest, nice contained population. So it has a human population of about 1,400 and a cockatoo population of about 120, all contained in one roost, just there. Okay, so to study the behaviour here, we first habituated that roost and then marked the entire population with these individual dots that allow us, that let them stick for about 3 to 6 months before they fade away. And this habituation also meant we could collect detailed close observations of birds and detailed information on them. And we measured their social networks and kinship and then did transects to watch bins and see them actually opening the bins over a couple of months. And this was mostly work by Barbara, who was a postdoc in the lab. Yeah, although it's not always obvious who's watching who in the case of the cockatoos. Okay, so first we observed that bin opening actually involves 5 distinct steps. So it is in itself a multi-step task for these birds to do. And these steps appear to take months to learn because there's many more birds in the process of learning than there are that are fully knowledgeable. And when we look at the social network, we can see a signature of this ongoing learning because birds that are in the process of learning are more connected to fully knowledgeable birds than we would expect by chance. And this is what we would expect to see if the behaviour was socially learned. So part of the reason, so it was only expressed by about 10% of the population in Stanwell Park, which is quite low, but another 30% in the process of learning. And part of the reason why this was low is because it was almost entirely done just by males. So it's a male-only culture in cockatoos. We're not entirely sure why yet. So we then extended the study to look across the whole range of the area that they open bins. And we collected more videos of bin opening across this range. And when we looked at these videos, we saw that actually there's variation in the way they can do each of these steps. For example, they could walk down the left of the bin or walk down the right of the bin. And individuals have distinct styles, so they're consistent in their behavior. But when we compare observation across different areas, we also see that there's spatial differences in this as well. So for example, whether they open the handle with their foot, like here, or they open it with their bill on the handle. And so this suggests, I mean, this is obviously all the one behavior of bin opening, but it suggests that we're actually getting the emergence of local subcultures in this behavior, which I would suggest is occurring because of drift, because of these quite clustered networks of the birds, and because this is over quite a large area. I'd also mention it's not spreading actually as fast as we think it could do, given the population of cockatoos and the obvious advantage to opening bins. So we think that might also be to do with their clustered social networks, although we now want to do some experiments to look at that. And maybe also to do with the fact that the males aren't actually the dispersing sex in the species as well. So lots of interesting things have happened since, because these are urban areas, and urban areas keep changing because they're very in flux all the time. And one thing that did happen in the lower half of this range in the Council of Wollongong is that they brought in FOGO bins. So now you're supposed to put your food waste, which is what the cockatoos are after, in the green bin and not in the red bin. And we knew from prior that almost 90% of attacks are on the red bin. So they're very selective as to what bin they think the food is in. They walk over the other bins. So this sounded all very interesting to us. So we went back to Stanwell Park and we did a full year of bin surveys, looking in people's bins, which, yeah, urban field work is the glamour of it, right? And this time we actually also looked in the bin. So the first question is, what are the humans doing? Well, what we can say is that over time in Stanmore Park, we found significantly more food in the green bin than in the red bin. Or sorry, significantly more food in the green bin over time. So people were taking council up on the FOGO idea. However, the food was now more evenly distributed, so there did appear to be some compliance issues. So what this does is actually kind of going back to your question, create uncertainty as to whether the food is going to be in that bin or that bin for the cockatoos. So what do the cockatoos do? Well, we can say that over the year, there were significantly more attempts on the green bin over time, so they were starting to switch to the green bin. However, successful openings were more likely to be on the bin with food in it, regardless of its colour. So this made us scratch our head for quite a while and have lots of debates. We thought there were three possibilities. One, they can smell where the food is. We don't think this is likely because they have a very bad sense of smell and all the bins are pretty smelly as well, and they're right next to each other. Two, it could be that the variation that we see up here is between people rather than between bins. So some bins, if they can remember, always have the food in the red bin and the other bins always have it in green, and they're just keeping track of each individual bin. Three, it could be a third possibility, and this is what Barbara noticed on the videos and we think might be what's going on. So here's a cockatoo. It doesn't care about the yellow bin. So it wants to open the big red bin, but look at this. First it checks. It's no good. And is then rejected that bin to open. And so Barbara's still finalizing the analysis here, but we think what the cockatoos might be doing is adding a step before they open it, which is an inspection step, and they're not opening the bin if they don't see any food in there, which is pretty cool, we think. And just to note, this kind of doing this over the full year also allowed us to see when it was most prevalent, and they mostly do this in winter. So we think that this is likely to be as a result of lack of food in the winter, and they're sort of supplementing with this high nutrition food. And maybe this trade-off of the effort of opening the bin versus the need for the food is maybe why males, which are slightly heavier than females, are more likely to do it because it's less work physically for them to open the bin. Okay, This is the sort of final piece of this. It makes a lot of mess. People don't like it, obviously. So now we have a human-wildlife conflict. And what people do is they start protecting their bin. And this then changes the resource for the birds, creating all sorts of interesting cultural dynamics. So how do you protect your bin from a cockatoo? It's not an easy problem to solve because the bin truck is automatic. So your bin still has to open when it's turned upside down. So you have to work out a way to stop the cockatoo getting in, but the bin can still open when it's turned upside down. And people have come up with amazing creative solutions for how they do this. Everything from a doormat, rocks on top of very popular, shoes in the hinges, pool noodle in the hinges, spikes, that's a bit of a standard one, all sorts of different things. And some of these, the cockatoos can now defeat. So here's one of our marks you can see on the back, that's green, pink, black.
It's pretty heavy, pretty.
Yeah, this bird only weighs maybe 900 grams.
Wow.
So that is quite a lot of effort to go to. They've inadvertently created extra protection, which is by having bad hinges that make it hard to, but the bird gets through. Okay, so we asked people what they did for protection, why they did it, and why they started and if they changed. And then Barbara ranked these all into efficiency levels that went from like no functional difference or rubber snake to scare them through to like full bungee lock. And what she found was that both suburbs and people tended to escalate over time. So over the years, we saw that more and more people were protecting bins and they were using the higher levels of bin protection efficiency. People also occasionally de-escalated. And when we asked them why they no longer protected their bins, they told us it was because cockatoos had stopped opening bins in the area. And this is a very common response. Bricks seemed to work for a while, but cockatoos got too clever. The neighbour on the other side of the highway suggested sticks. This is between the hinges, so it's like this sort of setup, stops them flipping it. They work. So what we actually saw was that 65% of people reported using social information, 60% directly referenced a neighbour or someone on their street that they were copying. So we wanted to test this directly. So Barbara and a team of field assistants went around 4 suburbs and looked at everybody's bin. They're pretty famous now in those suburbs. And this is Stanwell Park. And what we saw was that both whether or not they protected bins was clustered and the type of protection they did. And this was based on walking distance, not Euclidean distance. So they were more likely to be similar to their neighbours than the person behind them. So we think that's pretty good evidence for social learning on the part of humans. So we wondered, could this be an arms race to increasing complexity? So we're all familiar with the idea of an evolutionary arms race or a cultural arms race on the part of humans. But this is not something that's really ever been thought about in animals and not interspecifically. So we thought it would probably require a few steps. One, that there was iterated behavioural change on the part of 2 populations or species. 2, that this is driven by response to the other with escalation or de-escalation, both possible. And 3rd, that if this was done by learning at the individual level, we could think of it maybe as an innovation arms race. But if there was social learning on both sides, we could think of it as a cultural arms race. So do we have evidence for this? We think we have evidence for the top 2. The 3rd one, I think we've got evidence on the part of humans, not very surprising. On the part of the birds, we have evidence that they're learning, but not whether it's individual or social as yet. And this is the subject of a grant from the Cultural Evolution Society that Michael's been working on, still in collaboration with Barbara, who's moved on to a job. And we just finished data collection in October, so we haven't even coded the videos yet. So it's in progress, but we don't know. But if you wish to participate in our data collection, we have still this annual survey trying to track it over time at clevercockies.com. It's just reopened for the 2023 data. Okay, so overall, I think that hopefully you're convinced birds can have cultural traits and that we can study these sort of emergent property of this interaction between social systems, cognition, and the environment. And that changes in these can affect the form and passioning of cultures, and that also cultures aren't static but can change themselves in response to these sort of interactions. And also, hopefully I've convinced you that innovation, the spread of innovation and cultural change can be a source of rapid behavioural flexibility in populations, especially in terms of behavioural responses to rapid anthropogenic change. And the bin opening is sort of one case study of this. And these cities are really fascinating landscapes for these sorts of cultural dynamics, I think, for both humans and for animals, because they're changing both rapidly over time, but also at really small spatial scales as well. Sort of sometimes local council to local council can have different rules that affect the environment the animals are living in. So this is the subject of 5-year grant that we're 1 year into, where we're trying to study this both in Sydney and Canberra, kind of using both more experiments in the birds, but also studying their behaviour across the full urban landscape. So if you see us out on Sullivan's Creek, or you see pet marked cockatoos around that look a bit like this, then that's what we're doing. And you're always welcome to report it as well through our Citizen Science app, where we collect a lot of our data. And with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you. And thanks to all my funders, collaborators, and my fantastic lab group that this is all based on.
Thanks so much.